First thing I want you to understand is that I am not someone who came to this place looking for peace and quiet. I'm not a man running away from something. I took a job, the pay was reasonable, the housing was included, and my daughter had just started at a university I could not comfortably afford. When the Maritime Heritage Commission posted the listing for a seasonal lighthouse keeper at Barron Shoal Light, I applied the same afternoon. I had 22 years in the Coast Guard. I knew how to maintain marine equipment. I knew how to live in small spaces. There was nothing romantic about it. The interview was a phone call with a woman named Delia, who worked out of the Commission's regional office in Portland. She told me the position was a 6-month rotation, April through September, that I'd overlap for 2 weeks with the outgoing keeper to learn the specific systems, and that the lighthouse was technically decommissioned, but maintained as a historical site. The light still ran. Boats still used it. But it was no longer part of the official navigation network. I asked why the previous keeper was leaving. Delia paused long enough that I heard her chair creak. Then she said, "He completed his term. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Barron Shoal is a comma of rock about 11 miles off the main coast. You can see the town of Caris Harbour from the gallery deck on a clear day. A faint grey suggestion of rooftops and a church steeple. A supply boat comes every 2 weeks. There's radio contact with the harbour master, a satellite phone for emergencies. The lighthouse itself is a 46-foot brick tower attached to a keeper's cottage built in 1891 and renovated just enough to have plumbing and electric heat. The commission told me I could bring books, a laptop, personal effects. They said most keepers found the time restorative. I arrived on April 9th. The supply boat dropped me at the concrete pier with 2 duffel bags and a box of groceries. The outgoing keeper was supposed to meet me there. His name was Ellis Carraway. But when I climbed the path from the pier to the cottage, the door was standing open and there was no one inside. I found a note on the kitchen table, not one of the notes, just a normal note, written on the back of a supply receipt. It said, "Couldn't stay for the overlap. Instructions are in the desk. Radio if the compressor acts up." Below that, a signature I could barely read. I wasn't thrilled, but I wasn't alarmed. Some people are just bad at transitions. I figured Ellis had been alone out here for 6 months, gotten squirrely about human contact, and caught an early boat. The cottage was clean enough. The light was operational. I found the binder of maintenance protocols in the desk drawer, right where he said it would be. What he did not mention were the notebooks. There were 4 of them, standard composition books, shoved behind the binder and under a stack of old tide charts. They were not labeled. The first one had a date on the inside cover, October 12th, 6 months before I arrived, which would have been about a week after Ellis started his own rotation. I opened it that first night, mostly because I had nothing else to read. My books were still in the duffel, and I was too tired to dig them out. The first few pages were ordinary. Ellis described the island, the cottage, the view from the gallery. His handwriting was careful, almost architectural. He noted the weather, the condition of the equipment, what he ate for dinner. He mentioned that the supply boat operator, a man named Gus, had warned him that the foghorn compressor was temperamental. He wrote about seeing seals on the rocks, about the way the light swept the fog at night, carving a tunnel through it that collapsed immediately behind the beam, so it looked like the light was boring into something solid. That image stuck with me. I read it my first evening there, and then went up to the gallery to watch. He was right. In fog, the beam didn't illuminate. It excavated. The first note that didn't make sense appeared on the 11th page, between a paragraph about adjusting the foghorn timer and a note about a cracked window pane Ellis had written in the same careful handwriting. The tide schedule is wrong. Not the printed one, the actual tide. It came in 41 minutes ahead of what it should have. I timed it twice. The water does not reach the same height on the north side as the south side. This is not possible for an island this size. Below that, in smaller writing, as if he'd come back to it later. Check the tide tables again. They are correct. The water was wrong. I almost laughed. The water was wrong. That's the kind of thing you write when you've been alone too long and you start assigning intention to geography. But I noted it. I kept reading. Over the next 30 pages, the notes continued to alternate between mundane maintenance records and observations that sat at an odd angle. Ellis wrote that the foghorn echo returned from the wrong direction, not bouncing off the mainland, which was east, but from the open ocean to the west, where there was nothing for it to bounce off of for 3,000 miles. He wrote that he had started keeping a tally of the birds on the island, and that the count was different every time, not because birds came and went, but because the same birds, ones he'd learned to recognize by markings, sometimes appeared twice, two of the same gull on the same rock. He drew a small diagram of this, labeling each bird meticulously. He wrote, "I understand how this reads. I want to be precise because I know I will doubt myself later." There were two of the marked herring gull at 7:40 a.m. By 8:15, there was one. I did not see one leave. I put the notebook down that first night, thinking Ellis had been a lonely, possibly anxious man who'd let pattern recognition run away from him, the kind of person who sees faces in wallpaper. I went to sleep in the narrow keeper's bed, and the light swept across the ceiling every 4 seconds, and I thought about my daughter and whether she'd gotten the care package I'd sent before I left. The second week, I started noticing things on my own. Not the things Ellis described, different things. The cottage had a cellar, mostly used for storage. I went down to get a replacement air filter for the compressor and found that the cellar was larger than the footprint of the cottage. Not by much, maybe 4 feet in one direction. I stood at the far wall and looked up and knew I was standing under open ground, not under the building. The foundation stones were the same. The floor was the same poured concrete, but the space was wrong. I measured it the next day. I used a tape measure from the tool closet, started at the cellar's east wall, walked to the west wall, 31 feet. Then I went outside and measured the cottage foundation, 27 feet, 4 extra feet, underground, under dirt and rock. I sat on the front step for a long time after that, looking at the harbor across the water. I told myself the cottage had been renovated, that maybe the cellar predated the current structure, belonged to some older building. That was plausible. It was an old island. I didn't go into the cellar again for 5 days. During those 5 days, I read the second notebook. Ellis's tone had changed. The handwriting was the same, but the sentences were shorter, and he had started dating every entry not just by day, but by hour. He described waking at 3 a.m. to the sound of the foghorn running, going up to check and finding it off. Not winding down, often cold, as if it hadn't run in hours. But he had heard it. He went back to bed and heard it again 20 minutes later. This time, he didn't go up. He lay there and listened. He wrote, "It sounds like the foghorn, but it is not coming from the horn. It's coming from below the cottage, under the floor. The pitch is almost right. It is a very good imitation." He began documenting other imitations, the VHF radio producing a sound like Gus's voice, but when Ellis responded, there was no one on the channel. The sound of footsteps on the gallery catwalk that, when he checked, revealed no one there, and no footprints in the frost. And once this entry was heavily underlined, the sound of his own voice coming from the cellar while he sat in the kitchen directly above it, saying words he could almost but not quite make out. The rational part of me, and I want to be honest, that part was still in charge at this point, said auditory tricks, wind through old pipes, sleep deprivation, the thousand small sounds an old building makes that a lonely person starts to interpret. I had experienced similar things on Coast Guard cutters. When you're on watch at 3 a.m. in the North Atlantic, you hear things. Your brain fills silence with meaning because it cannot tolerate the absence. But I could not explain the cellar. I measured it again. 31 feet. The cottage above was still 27. At the start of my 3rd week, the supply boat came. Gus was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with hands like catcher's mitts. He helped me carry the crates up the path, and I offered him coffee in the kitchen. I asked him about Ellis. Gus stirred his coffee for a long time. Then he said, "Ellis was fine when he started, real organized, had a system for everything. By the end, he wasn't coming down to the pier when I arrived. I'd have to go up and find him. Last couple months, he looked like he hadn't slept. But he didn't want to talk about it. I'd ask, and he'd say everything was operational. That word exactly. Operational." I asked Gus if anyone else had ever reported strange things on the island. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. He said, "The keeper before Ellis lasted 3 months and quit. The one before that did the full 6, but never applied again. The commission has trouble filling this post." He paused, "But no one's ever told me anything specific." After Gus left, I went back to the notebooks. I'd been reading them slowly, maybe 6 or 7 pages a night, the way you'd ration something. I think part of me knew that reading them too fast was dangerous, not because they contained something supernatural, but because Ellis's logic was careful and his observations were precise, and the more I read, the harder it became to dismiss him. The 3rd notebook was different from the first 2. Ellis had stopped recording maintenance activities entirely. Every entry was an observation, and every observation was an attempt to describe something he called the pattern. He did not define this term the first time he used it. He wrote as if he'd already explained it, as if I should know. The pattern was something he'd started to perceive in the relationship between the tides, the sounds, the spatial wrongness of the cellar, and something new, the light itself. He wrote, "I've been watching the beam from the north side of the island, near the water. At 11:47 p.m. on December 3rd, the beam completed a rotation and then, for a single pass, illuminated something on the water that was not there on the previous pass or the following one. I cannot describe what I saw, not because it was indescribable, but because I do not yet have the right framework. It was large. It was not a boat. It was not land. It occupied space the way a memory occupies the mind completely, but without substance. Further on, the pattern is not in any single anomaly. It is in the relationship between all of them. The tide comes early by the exact number of minutes that the foghorn echo is delayed. The cellar extends by the same proportion that the bird count doubles. These are not coincidences. They are ratios. Something is expressing itself mathematically through the physical properties of this island, and the message is spatial. It is telling me about a shape. This is where I need to tell you what happened on my 23rd night. I was on the gallery deck, performing the routine check of the lens housing. It was a clear night, no fog, and the beam was cutting clean arcs across open water. I could see the lights of Caris Harbour to the east. I was thinking about my daughter. She'd called me on the satellite phone that afternoon and told me she was thinking of changing her major. And I'd said something supportive that I wasn't sure I meant. And I was replaying the conversation, trying to figure out what I actually thought. The beam came around. Open water, rocks, the white curl of surf, darkness. It came around again. Open water, rocks, surf. And between the rocks and the darkness, something else. Not on the water, in it, below the surface but visible. The way you can sometimes see a whale's shadow under the chop. Except this was not a whale. It was geometric. It had angles. It was the size of a building, or several buildings, and it was regular, repeating, structured, like looking down into a city grid submerged just below the wave tops. The beam passed it and the darkness closed, and on the next rotation, it was gone. I stood on the gallery for 2 hours, watching every pass of the beam. It did not reappear. I went downstairs and opened the 3rd notebook to the entry I'd read that afternoon. The one about the beam illuminating something that was not there on the previous pass or the following one. Ellis had seen the same thing, or something similar enough, that his description matched my experience with an accuracy that made my mouth go dry. This is the part where I tell you, I almost called Gus on the radio. I almost called the commission. I almost packed my bag and sat on the pier until the next supply delivery. But I didn't. And the reason I didn't is complicated, and I need you to hear it clearly, because it's the part that matters most. I didn't stay because I was drawn to the mystery. I didn't stay because I was brave or foolish or mesmerized. I stayed because I had a job, and my daughter's tuition was due in 6 weeks, and if I quit before the minimum 90-day period, I would forfeit the completion bonus that I had already mentally spent. That's it. That is the whole reason. I stayed for money. I want that to be clear because it matters for what I did later. The 4th notebook. I'd been saving it. Some part of me understood that the 4th notebook was the one that would change things, because it was the last one. And whatever Ellis had concluded or discovered or become would be in those pages. I opened it on the 1st of May, 3 weeks into my rotation. The handwriting was different, not degraded, transformed. The same architectural precision, but the letters were smaller, denser, and Ellis had started incorporating diagrams directly into the text. The diagrams were geometric, circles overlapping circles, triangles nested inside triangles, and at the center of each diagram, a shape I can only describe as a three-dimensional object drawn in 2 dimensions by someone who could actually see the third dimension. They had a solidity to them. Your eye kept trying to fall into them. Ellis wrote, "I have been measuring the cellar every day. It grows by approximately 1.3 inches per week in the westward direction. I have also been measuring the tower. The tower's interior height is increasing at the same rate. The staircase now has 77 steps. When I arrived, it had 74. I am not losing my mind. I have photographs. The photographs show 74 steps because the camera cannot see the new ones. Only I can. The new steps are there when I climb them and absent when I look at the pictures. This means the growth is not physical. It is perceptual. The island is not literally getting larger. My ability to perceive it is expanding. And then, a week later, I understand the pattern now. The island is an expression. It is a single point in a structure so large that it extends beyond the physical dimensions we can access. What I have been perceiving, the tides, the sounds, the spatial expansion, are cross-sections, like pushing a 3-dimensional object through a 2-dimensional plane and watching the shapes it makes. The island is where something presses through. The light does not illuminate it. The light is part of the expression. The rotation of the beam is a clock. It is counting. And then, in the last entry, dated March 28th, less than 2 weeks before I arrived, I know what it is counting toward. I will not write it here, not because I want to protect whoever reads this, but because writing it would be inaccurate. Language is a 2-dimensional tool, and this is a 3-dimensional truth. You will need to see it for yourself. Go to the cellar on the night the beam count reaches 11,497 from the start of your rotation. Stand at the west wall, the wall that should not be there. You will understand. I counted. I'd been on the island for 23 days. The beam rotated once every 4 seconds. That is 15 rotations per minute, 900 per hour, 21,600 per day. In 23 days, the beam had completed 496,800 rotations. I was so far past 11,497 that the number was absurd. Unless Ellis didn't mean from the first rotation. Unless he meant from a specific starting point that I had not yet identified. I spent 3 days trying to decode this. I read back through all 4 notebooks looking for a reference to when the count should begin. I found nothing. And during those 3 days, I measured the cellar twice more. 31 feet, both times. The same 4 extra feet. No growth. But on the 3rd night, something changed. I was lying in bed, listening to the beam mechanism turning above me, the quiet motorized hum and the periodic click as the lens housing completed each rotation. I'd been hearing it every night for almost a month. And on this night, I realized it was not consistent. The clicks were not evenly spaced. Most were exactly 4 seconds apart. But every so often, maybe once every few minutes, there was a longer gap. 4.3 seconds, 4.7. And once, while I held my breath and counted, 5.1. The beam was hesitating, not mechanically. I checked the mechanism the next morning and it was running perfectly. Smooth rotation, no grinding, no resistance. But the light itself was pausing, lingering on certain points of its arc. If you watched it from inside, from the gallery, You couldn't tell. The rotation looked uniform. But if you listened, if you counted the seconds between clicks, you could hear it dwelling. I began tracking the long pauses. I sat in bed with a stopwatch and a notebook, and I logged every pause over 4.2 seconds. After 2 nights, I had a sequence. The pauses came in clusters, 7 pauses, then a long stretch of regularity, then 12 pauses, then regularity, then 3, 7, 12, 3. On the 3rd night of counting, the sequence repeated exactly 7, 12, 3, 7, 12, 3. I sat up in bed and stared at the wall, and I knew, not believed, not suspected, knew that the beam was signaling. This is the moment I have to tell you about the choice I made, because it's the only part of this story that I am responsible for. Everything else was observation. This was action. I did not investigate the signal. I did not go to the cellar. I did not try to decode the sequence or match it to Ellis's diagrams. Instead, I got up at dawn, walked to the pier, turned on the VHF radio, and called Gus. I told him I needed an emergency pickup. He asked if I was injured. I said no. He asked if the equipment was damaged. I said no. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'll be there in 2 hours." I packed my bags. I left the notebooks where they were, in the desk drawer behind the binder. I did not take them. I considered destroying them and decided it was not my right. They belonged to Ellis, and whatever he'd experienced was his to document. But I left them for the next person, because I am not certain they are dangerous. I am not certain of anything about them, except that they are accurate. Gus picked me up at 9 in the morning. As we pulled away from the island, I looked back at the lighthouse and watched the beam, still running in daylight, pale and almost invisible against the grey sky. From the water, the rotation looked perfectly uniform. 4 seconds, 4 seconds, 4 seconds. I called the commission from Gus's truck and told Delia I was resigning effective immediately, and I understood I would lose the completion bonus. She processed the paperwork without argument, which told me I was not the first person to make that call. My daughter's tuition was late that semester. I took out a loan. She asked me why I left the job, and I told her the island was too isolated for me, which is true in a way that I could not have explained to her. Here is what I need to say, and then I'm done. The notes made sense. That's the thing I can't get past. If Ellis had been rambling, if his observations had been vague or mystical or self-aggrandizing, I could have filed them under delusion and moved on. But they were specific. They were measurable. He gave numbers, dates, dimensions, and every number I checked was either confirmed by my own measurements or was consistent with data I could verify independently. The tide tables, the cellar dimensions, the step count. I counted the stairs my first day before I ever found the notebooks. 74. Exactly what Ellis said. And the thing he described on the water, I saw it, unprompted, unprimed, before I'd read that entry. I saw it first and found his description after. I do not believe Ellis went mad. I believe Ellis perceived something real that the island either generates or transmits or simply is. Something geometric and structured and patient, and I believe the notebooks are a genuine attempt to describe it using tools, language, measurement, logic, that are not adequate to the task. I believe the 4th notebook's final instruction was sincere. I believe that If I had gone to the cellar on the right night, at the right count, I would have understood. And I believe I was right to leave, not because I was afraid, although I was, not because I thought it would harm me, because I have no evidence of that. Ellis was not harmed as far as I know. He walked off the island under his own power, signed his paperwork, and went home. I was right to leave because I have a daughter, and she needs a father whose perceptions match the world she lives in, and I was not confident that would remain true if I stayed. I think about the cellar. I think about the beam hesitating, counting out its 7s and 12s and 3s over the black water. I think about the shape I saw below the surface, the impossible geometry of it, the way it looked like a city or a circuit or a language. I think about Ellis's careful handwriting and the quiet certainty in his final entry. You will understand. I don't want to understand. That's not the same as not wanting to know. I want to know desperately. But understanding would require becoming someone who perceives more than I currently do. And I have built a life inside the dimensions I have, and the people I love live here with me, and I will not leave them behind to go deeper into a truth that doesn't include them. Some nights I lie awake and I count to myself. 7, 12, 3. I don't know what it means. I don't know what it's counting toward. But I hear the rhythm in my chest like a second heartbeat, steady and foreign and precise. And I know the beam is still turning out there on Barren Shoal, sweeping its light across the water, pausing on the things it needs me to see. And I am not there to see them. That is the hardest thing. Not the fear, the absence. The light is still counting, and I am here, and the number is getting larger, and somewhere in that sequence is the one that would have opened the cellar wall for me, and it will come and go without me there to witness it, and that will be the right outcome, and I will grieve it for the rest of my life.